The summer of 1985 had one of those skies that felt endless, blue fading into honeyed gold as the sun sank over the small Illinois town of Elbin. On Elm Street, you could hear the screen doors creak and the distant hum of a lawnmower. It was an ordinary Thursday evening, the kind that never should have mattered, except that it became the last one anyone would remember clearly. Inside a modest white house with front porch wrapped in ivy, a woman named Diane Ellman stood barefoot on the wood steps, watering a row of petunias. She was 36, quiet but kind, with a laugh that always seemed to start small and bloom like a song. Her daughter, Katie, 9 years old and full of restless summer energy, chased a ball across the front yard, her braids flying behind her. Neighbors waved the way small-town neighbors do, with the ease of familiarity. They'd later say Diane seemed distracted that night, as if her thoughts were somewhere far away. Dinner was simple: macaroni and cheese, a salad, and 2 glasses of milk left half-finished. On the counter, Diane's purse sat open, her keys resting beside it. The radio murmured softly, an old country song blending with the rhythmic chirp of crickets outside. Everything about the house felt lived in and safe. A child's drawing taped the fridge, a stack of library books by the couch, the faint smell of laundry detergent in the air. Yet beneath that comfort, something unspoken lingered, a sense of pause, like the quiet breath before a storm. At 8:17 p.m., a neighbor across the street noticed a porch light flicker. He looked up from his newspaper just in time to see Diane call Katie inside. Moments later, the sound of the screen door closing echoed faintly down the block. After that, nothing. No car pulling away. No shouting. No sound at all. Just silence, heavy and strange, pressing against the edges of the neighborhood. By 10, the streets were empty. A dog barked once, then stopped. The porch light was still on, burning steadily now, casting a soft glow on 2 empty chairs and a watering can tipped on its side. Inside the house, a clock ticked past midnight. The phone went unanswered. The half-finished dinner turned cold. Morning would come, as it always does, washing over the town with sunlight and routine. People would get up, make coffee, head to work. No one yet knew that somewhere between the laughter of a child and the flicker of that porch light, something irreversible had happened. There's a moment in every disappearance that divides time into before and after. Before, the world makes sense. After, it never quite does again. For the Ellmans, that invisible line was drawn quietly, without a struggle, without witnesses, without warning. It was as if mother and daughter had simply stepped out of their lives and into thin air. But in that house, frozen in the warmth of an ordinary summer night, the traces of them remained. A pair of shoes by the door, a toothbrush still wet, a lamp left on in the living room, its light soft and waiting, as if expecting them to return at any moment. The air itself felt suspended, holding its breath. And from that night forward, Elbin, Illinois would never feel the same again. Morning arrived soft and pale, the kind of light that makes everything seem harmless. Dew clung to the grass. The air smelled faintly of lilacs, and birds trilled from the telephone wires. It could have been any morning in any quiet town. But by 8 a.m., the small rhythm of Elbin had already started to falter. At the public library on Main Street, Diane Ellman's absence was the first note of unease. She was punctual, almost ritualistic, always the first to unlock the doors, always with a thermos of coffee and a smile that welcomed the early readers. When 10 minutes passed, her co-worker, a woman named Susan Price, thought little of it. When an hour slipped by, the unease began to grow. Diane's car wasn't in the parking lot, and no one had seen her drop Katie at school either. Across town, the school bus driver checked his clipboard again. Katie's name was still circled, her seat still empty. Children pressed their faces against the glass, whispering. At first, it was just another absence, one of those small things that would normally go unnoticed. But small towns have a way of noticing everything when something feels wrong. By mid-morning, Susan called Diane's home. The line rang, then rang again. No answer. She left a message, her tone cheerful at first, then hesitant. She tried again an hour later, still nothing. Finally, at 2 p.m., she phoned the local police station, apologizing for overreacting, but explaining that Diane wasn't the kind of woman to simply not show up. When Officer Raymond Clark arrived at the Elman residence, the house looked unchanged. The porch light was still on, though the sun was high now, bleaching the yard in gold. The front door was locked. He knocked 3 times, waited, then circled to the back, calling their names. Through the kitchen window, he saw the faint shape of a coffee mug on the counter. It was half full. Clark jimmied the back door open. It swung inward with a dry creak. The air inside was still, stale, like a room left sealed too long. Nothing appeared broken, nothing overturned. The television sat dark, the radio silent. On the counter, Diane's purse lay open, her wallet inside. Her keys were next to the sink. A single plate with crusted macaroni remained in the sink, as though rinsing had been interrupted. In the living room, a small pink sweater was draped over the arm of the couch. Beside it, one of Katie's storybooks lay open to a page where a hand-drawn princess stared into the woods. The book's spine was cracked from love, the paper soft from handling. Upstairs, Diane's bed was made. Katie's wasn't. Her stuffed rabbit sat on the pillow, tilted slightly forward, as though waiting for her to come back and tuck it under her arm. Clark moved carefully through the house, touching nothing. The refrigerator hummed quietly. The cat, a gray tabby named Clover, darted from beneath the kitchen table and meowed sharply, hungry, frightened, confused. Its water bowl was dry. Clark crouched down, whispering something under his breath that even he didn't fully understand. Outside, 2 patrol cars arrived, followed by a handful of neighbors drawn by curiosity and concern. They spoke in hushed voices on the lawn, their faces pale. One mentioned hearing the screen door late last night. Another swore they saw Diane's silhouette at the window around 9. But no one saw them leave. By evening, the house had turned from home to evidence. Police took photographs of every corner, every object, every quiet detail. A pair of footprints led from the porch steps into grass, then vanished halfway to the street. The phone record showed no outgoing calls after 7:40 p.m. Detectives arrived from Kane County, their presence heavier, more clinical. They dusted for prints, examined the unlocked back door, and noted the untouched valuables. No sign of robbery, no forced entry, no blood. It was the kind of scene that told a story without telling one at all. As the sun began to dip again, the same soft orange light from the night before bled across the walls. The house looked nearly identical to how it must have been 24 hours earlier, except for the officers moving silently through it, their radios whispering static. The scent of old coffee still lingered. That night, the police sealed the property, placing yellow tape across the doorframe. The neighbors stood outside, arms folded, speaking in fragments. Maybe she took a trip. Maybe they're with family. Maybe it's nothing. But no one truly believed it. Somewhere in that quiet town, a line had been crossed. The normal rhythms, the school bell, the grocery runs, the casual waves across driveways, felt slightly off, as though the town itself was holding its breath. The Elman house, now dark behind its porch light, stood like an unanswered question, and inside, the smallest details refused to fade. A child's drawing of sun taped to the fridge, the hum of the refrigerator, and a faint impression of 2 lives that had gone missing without sound, without struggle, without goodbye. By the second morning, the quiet unease that hung over Elbin began to shift into something heavier. The news spread slowly at first, a whisper at the post office, a cautious mention at the diner. By noon, it had turned into a steady pulse of fear running through the town. Everyone knew by then Diane and Katie Elman were missing. Posters went up almost immediately. Photocopied images of Diane's soft smile and Katie's gap-toothed grin fluttered on telephone poles and gas station windows. Beneath them, in bold black letters, "Missing. Last seen August 15th. The words looked too stark, too official, for a community that wasn't used to headlines or crime scenes. Elbin was a place where people left doors unlocked, where kids biked to the creek until dark, where neighbors looked out for one another. But that week, curtains stayed drawn and children were called home early. The sound of laughter vanished from the streets. It was as if the town itself had dimmed. Dozens of volunteers gathered at the local fire station to help search. Men brought flashlights, women packed sandwiches, and the old paper mill lent out two-way radios. By sundown, lines of people stretched through the cornfields and into the woods beyond the highway, calling names into the dusk. Diane, Katie. The echoes came back empty, their voices scattering among the cicadas. The local pastor led a candlelight vigil outside the library, Diane's workplace. The steps were covered with flowers and small paper cranes made by Katie's classmates. People prayed, though no one quite knew what to ask for anymore. Safety, truth, or maybe just a sign. Margaret, Diane's older sister, stood among them, clutching one of Diane's scarves like it was a lifeline. Her face didn't move when the pastor spoke. Her eyes, rimmed in red, stayed fixed on the candle flame as if afraid to blink and lose it. For the first few days, police combed through every possible lead. They interviewed neighbors, co-workers, delivery drivers. Someone claimed they saw Diane's car near the state route late that night. Another swore she heard a woman shouting near the riverbank. But each clue frayed under scrutiny. No tire marks. No witnesses who could agree on the time. Helicopters circled the woods near the Fox River, their spotlights cutting through the dark. Divers searched shallow bends, pulling up nothing but driftwood and old debris. Every time they surfaced, Margaret's breath hitched. Every time they shook their heads, she turned away. The following week brought rain, steady, cold, and relentless. It turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud, washed out footprints, and blurred chalk markings that had been drawn to track search routes. Still, people kept coming. Retirees brought coffee to the volunteers. Teenagers handed out ponchos. The town's high school canceled classes, so students could join the effort. Even strangers from nearby counties arrived with flashlights and gloves, their boots sinking into the wet earth. At night, the town gathered at the church basement. Officers pinned maps to the wall, marking off grids of search terrain with red ink. Each unchecked box became its own small ache. Each passing day without discovery made the air heavier. Reporters began to appear, first local, then regional. Cameras flashed in the rain. Questions grew sharper, more invasive. Did Diane have enemies? Was there trouble at home? Any signs of struggle? Margaret answered what she could. But mostly she shook her head. No, she loved her daughter. She loved her job. She wouldn't just leave. Her voice trembled on the word wouldn't, the kind of tremor that comes from rehearsing a truth you're no longer certain of. Theories began to divide the town. Some whispered about a stranger passing through, a drifter, a traveling salesman, a man with no ties. Others believed Diane might have run away, trying to start over somewhere new. A few cruel voices suggested something darker, something within the home itself. But none of it matched the image everyone held of her. The gentle librarian who baked cookies for school fundraisers, who walked Katie to class every morning, who smiled at everyone, even on bad days. By late September, search teams had dwindled. The posters had begun to curl at the corners. The police set up a tip line, but most calls led nowhere. Still, the town refused to stop caring. The local paper, the Elbin Herald, ran a photo of Diane and Katie on its front page every Sunday with the same headline, "Still Missing." One crisp October evening, a group of children found a torn piece of paper by the edge of the river, a child's drawing. It showed two stick figures, one tall, one small, standing beside what looked like water. The taller one had a blue dress. The smaller one held a yellow balloon. It might have been nothing, a coincidence. But when Margaret saw it, her hands trembled. She swore the drawing looked exactly like one Katie had taped to her fridge just before she disappeared. A week later, another search party found a broken silver wristwatch lodged between rocks downstream. It was engraved with initials, D.E. The glass was cracked, the time frozen at 8:24. No one could say if it was Diane's. Margaret thought it might be, but police kept it anyway, a relic from the night that refused to explain itself. As autumn deepened, Elbin began to change. Halloween decorations went up, but no one smiled while hanging them. The laughter of trick-or-treaters sounded hollow, nervous. The lights in the Elman house remained off, except for that single porch bulb that flickered every few nights, as if still waiting for someone to come home. The case began to stretch beyond the limits of a search. It became part of the town's identity. At church, at school, in the grocery store, people mentioned the Elmans in soft tones, as though speaking their names too loudly might disturb whatever fragile boundary existed between the living and the lost. Every small town has one story that never fades, one that defines its silence. For Elbin, it was a story of mother and daughter who vanished without reason, leaving behind nothing but echoes, photographs, and the unbearable question that hung in the air long after the searchlights dimmed. Where did they go? And how could a whole world simply erase them overnight? By November, the warmth had drained from Illinois. Bare trees reached up like blackened hands against a sky the color tin, and the search for Diane and Katie Elman shifted from frantic hope to quiet, procedural persistence. The posters were still there, faded now, their ink bleeding from rain, but the town's urgency had curdled into something colder. Suspicion, the kind that doesn't shout, but whispers behind curtains and over grocery aisles. Detectives began widening the investigation. Without evidence of abduction, without ransom, and without a single confirmed sighting, every possibility had to be considered. The police chief, a stoic man named Warren Mills, stood before a wall of photographs in his office. Diane's smiling face looked out from the center, surrounded by maps, phone records, and lists of names. The longer he stared, the more he felt that stillness wasn't absence. It was intent. Someone had made them disappear. Quietly, cleanly. One report drew his attention. A truck driver named Dennis Hayes claimed he saw a tan sedan, similar to Diane's 1980 Chevrolet Citation, parked near the old Fox River Bridge around 9 p.m. on the night of August 15th. He remembered it because of its position. Pulled halfway off the gravel shoulder, headlights still faintly glowing. Next to it, a man in a beige jacket stood facing the river, smoking. Dennis assumed the driver had car trouble, but when he passed the same bridge again hours later, the car was gone. Detectives followed up immediately, canvassing the area around the bridge. The river's current ran low that time of year, thick with reeds and the smell of damp leaves. They found nothing, no tire impressions, no footprints, no remnants of a vehicle. But something about that sighting stuck. It was the first solid image of anything that night. A car, a man, a place. Witness accounts from that week began to overlap in strange ways. A woman living near Route 38 said she saw someone walking alone toward town just before midnight. A tall man, collar turned up against the wind, moving quickly. She thought nothing of it until she saw Diane's photo in the paper days later. Another resident, a retiree who lived by the bridge, told police he'd heard voices, soft, urgent, arguing. A woman and a man, he said, then silence. But none of them could describe the man clearly. Beige jacket, dark hair, medium height, a face that seemed to dissolve in memory the moment they tried to recall it. For a time, suspicion turned inward. The police re-interviewed Diane's co-workers. They asked about her relationships, her recent mood. Had she been planning something? Did she have problems at home? Susan Price hesitated before admitting Diane had seemed distracted in the weeks before she vanished, forgetting small things, staring out the library window for long minutes. When pressed, she mentioned a man who had visited her at work once, mid-afternoon, asking for her by name. Diane had stepped outside to speak with him, visibly uncomfortable. When she returned, she told Susan it was an old friend and changed the subject. Police checked the library's visitor log for that day. The entry was blank. Then came a neighbor's story, a retired mechanic named Paul Linden. He lived 2 houses down from Diane's and said he often saw her talking to a man near her porch at night, sometime after sunset. Sometimes the man brought flowers. Sometimes they argued in low voices. He described him as a loner type, always wearing a cap. When detectives showed him a series of photographs of local men, Paul pointed to one, Alan Brewer, Diane's former boyfriend. Brewer, 41, worked as a welder on construction sites outside Aurora. He and Diane had dated briefly 2 years earlier. Their breakup, by most accounts, had been uneventful, but Brewer had a temper, and there were rumors he'd struggled with alcohol after his divorce. Police brought him in for questioning. Brewer appeared calm, cooperative even. He said he hadn't seen Diane in over 6 months and denied visiting her home. His alibi, drinking at a friend's house the night of August 15th, was thin but technically verifiable. Still, there was something in his eyes when he spoke about her, something detached, almost resentful. He described her as a good woman, just always thinking she was better than this town. The detectives noted his phrasing but had no physical evidence, no confession, no trace. Brewer remained a person of interest, but without cause to arrest. The investigation widened further. A composite sketch of the man by the bridge was released to the press. It led to dozens of tips, none credible. Some claimed they saw the same man in neighboring towns. Others said he'd been seen hitchhiking along the interstate. But each call dissolved into rumor. As winter set in, the Ellman house became a landmark of discomfort. Children crossed the street rather than walk past it. Adults lowered their voices when its silhouette appeared through the frost. Margaret, unable to stay away, visited daily, standing on the porch, staring through the window as if she could will her sister back into existence. She told a reporter once, "It's like the house is holding its breath, like it knows what happened but won't say." The town began to fracture under the weight of its own uncertainty. People stopped trusting each other. The friendly nods at the grocery store turned to brief, wary glances. "What if it was someone we know?" became the quiet refrain. One evening, a young deputy driving near the bridge spotted something small glinting in the gravel, a cigarette lighter, engraved with the initials AB. The find reignited local gossip about Brewer, but tests later showed nothing conclusive. It could have belonged to anyone. Every theory the police chased led to another wall. Theories branched like veins, each plausible, none complete. A stranger passing through. A lover's dispute turned tragic. A planned escape that went wrong. No scenario fit perfectly. By Christmas, the snow had buried the last traces of summer. The river froze in uneven layers of glass, the bridge looming above it like a relic of something sacred and broken. And though the case remained open, it was already beginning to cool in the public mind. Still, that image persisted in everyone's imagination. The tan car by the bridge, the man in the beige jacket, the faint glow of headlights fading into the night. Theories came and went, but one question lingered beneath them all. Was he real, or had the town created him out of its own need for a villain? Because sometimes, when a mystery goes too long without answers, people begin inventing them just to feel less powerless. And in Elbin, powerlessness was becoming its own kind of plague. The snow melted slowly that spring, revealing the muddy ground beneath, a tired landscape, gray and thin, like a town waking from a long fever. Elbin tried to move on, but the absence of Diane and Katie Ellman hung over everything like a shadow that refused to fade. The posters were gone now, peeled away by rain and time, replaced with flyers for garage sales and summer fairs. Yet if you asked anyone about that August night, they'd still pause before answering, as if touching a wound that never healed. The official investigation had stalled by early 1986. Leads had dried up, evidence had gone cold. The last formal search was conducted in March, when a team of volunteers combed through the woods west of the Fox River. They found nothing but a single shoe, too small, too new, likely lost by another child long after the Ellmans were gone. It was returned to the police station anyway, bagged and labeled, filed under unconfirmed. Even the officers stopped believing it would matter. Detective Mills, who had led the case since the beginning, packed the boxes himself. He stacked them neatly in the evidence room, one atop the other. Ellman case, 1985 to 86. Before sealing the last one, he hesitated. There was something unbearably final about the sound of that tape strip tearing across cardboard. "Sometimes," he said to the clerk beside him, "we don't solve things. We just carry them." Then he switched off the light. For Margaret, time did not move forward. It folded in on itself. After weeks of pleading with police, she made the decision to move into her sister's house. She told friends it was just until we find them, but years would pass before she admitted she never intended to leave. The house had changed. Dust gathered on picture frames, the air heavy with stillness. She left Diane's room exactly as it had been. The bed made, the dresser untouched, the radio unplugged. In Katie's room, She kept the curtains drawn and the toys in their original places. Every night, before going to bed, she would open the door, look inside, and whisper, "Good night, sweetheart," as if the girl were merely asleep. She spent her days rewriting her sister's story in her mind. Different versions, different endings. In one, Diane had run away to start over somewhere new, building a small life near the ocean. In another, they'd been taken but managed to survive, living under different names. She clung to these fictions because the truth was unbearable, and in their imagined survival, she could still breathe. Neighbors began to avoid her, not out of cruelty but discomfort. The sight of Margaret on the porch, watering Diane's flowers in silence, was a reminder of what hadn't been resolved. They waved politely, then crossed the street. Sometimes children rode by on bicycles and stared at the house, whispering that it was haunted. Inside, Margaret tried to maintain order, as if control could bring them back. She cleaned the windows, scrubbed the floors, replaced light bulbs that rarely needed replacing. She hung fresh curtains and kept the porch light on every night. "So they can see their way home," she'd tell herself, her voice trembling but steady. But time doesn't stop for the grieving. It only slows, thickens, and reshapes everything it touches. By the early 1990s, most of the town's faces had changed. New families moved in, unaware of what had happened. The Ellman case became local folklore, the kind of story whispered by teenagers on summer nights, half warning, half legend. Yet for Margaret, it remained immediate. Each birthday that passed without a card, each Christmas when 2 stockings stayed empty, she kept writing letters addressed to Diane, tucking them into a drawer in the kitchen. The letters began like conversations, updates about neighbors, weather, small-town gossip, but always ended the same way. "Please come home. Please tell me you're okay." The police called once every few years, out of formality. "We're reopening a review," they'd say, but nothing ever changed. Files were reread, statements rechecked, tips reevaluated, then silence again. The voices on the other end grew younger as the decades turned. Officers who hadn't even been alive when Diane and Katie vanished. One afternoon in 1994, Margaret found herself sitting on the porch, watching dust motes spin in the sunlight. Across the street, the same neighbor who had once heard the screen door that night was selling his house. The for sale sign leaned slightly to one side, its white paint peeling. For the first time, she realized how much time had passed. The world had moved on. The laughter that once filled this block had changed generations. Only she remained, anchored to a night no one could explain. Inside, the house began to creak differently. The floorboards moaned with age. The windows fogged even in mild weather. She began to hear things sometimes. The faint echo of a child's giggle, the sound of a car door closing outside. She'd rush to the window, heart racing, only to find the street empty. The mind, she told herself, plays tricks when it's starved for closure. Still, she couldn't leave. Every attempt ended with the same feeling, that if she walked away, she'd miss something. A call, a letter, a knock on the door, as if Diane and Katie might somehow return and find no one waiting. So she stayed, keeping the house alive in her absence. The local paper stopped mentioning the case around then. Its silence was its own kind of death notice. The community, weary from hope, buried the story in its collective memory. The Ellmans became a ghost note in the town's history, something sad and unsolved that no one wanted to say out loud. But Margaret did. Every Sunday, she visited the edge of the Fox River, standing near the bridge where the car was last seen. She'd bring 2 daisies, Diane's favorite flower, and toss them into the water. She never prayed, never spoke, just watched them drift away. The act was quiet, ritualistic, and perhaps the only thing that kept her from unraveling completely. By the mid-1990s, the once bright Ellman home had turned into a weathered shell of its former self. The paint flaked in long white strips, the garden overgrown. But at night, from a distance, there was still one constant glow, the porch light. People said it was eerie, that Margaret was clinging to ghosts. But others, the ones who remembered Diane's kindness and Katie's laugh, thought differently. They said that light wasn't for ghosts at all. It was for the living, a beacon for 2 souls who might still be out there somewhere, lost but not gone. And so, as the seasons cycled endlessly over the town, the house waited. Margaret waited. The unanswered questions waited. Life went on around them, but for that one small corner of Illinois, time had frozen at 8:17 p.m. on an August evening in 1985, when Mother called her daughter inside, and the world quietly lost them both. By the summer of 2002, 17 years after Diane and Katie Ellman vanished, the case had become little more than a paragraph in old archives, a cold file stored in the basement of the county courthouse. But stories, especially the kind that end without answers, have a way of resurfacing when the world least expects it. It began, oddly enough, with a property sale. A family from Wisconsin purchased a small farmhouse near the Illinois border, a lonely, sun-faded structure standing on a stretch of land that had once belonged to an older man named Harold Dean. The house had been empty for years, its windows clouded with grime, the roof sagging slightly as if weighed down by its own secrets. When the new owners began renovations, they stumbled upon something strange. Behind a loose wall panel in the attic, wrapped carefully in an old quilt, was a stack of notebooks, about a dozen of them, tied together with twine. The covers were worn and discolored, the pages yellowed with age. At first, the family assumed they belonged to the previous owner. They flipped through a few and saw neat handwriting, entries written in blue ink, dated from 1984 to 1989. They seemed personal but harmless. Daily notes, reflections on weather, crops, loneliness, until one line caught their eye. She stopped coming by after the storm. I didn't mean for it to happen. The words were underlined twice. That sentence set off a chain of events that would reopen a mystery the town had long buried. The journals were turned over to the sheriff's department. When the lead investigator, now a gray-haired man named Roger Hayes, began reading through them, he quickly realized they weren't just musings. They were confessions, fragmented, obsessive, and disturbingly specific. The author wrote about a woman with warm brown hair and a little girl who laughs too loud, about evenings on the porch and the sound of her voice before everything went quiet. One passage read, "I didn't want to hurt them. I just wanted them to stay. But when she looked at me like that, when she said she'd never come back, something broke in me." The dates aligned almost perfectly with the time Diane and Katie went missing. The farmhouse belonged to Harold Dean, a man who had lived a quiet, solitary life. He was known around town as a bit of a recluse, polite but withdrawn, working odd jobs and selling vegetables at the local market. No one had ever suspected him of anything. He had died in 1997, alone, buried in an unmarked grave in a rural cemetery. With his death, whatever secrets he carried had gone with him. Until now, Detective Hayes requested a forensic examination of the journals. The handwriting matched samples of Harold's from tax documents and letters. But what unsettled investigators most wasn't just a potential confession. It was a tone. The words were lucid, remorseful, and filled with unsettling tenderness. In one entry, dated September 4th, 1985, Harold wrote, "The child liked the river. She said the water looked like glass. I wish I could take it back, all of it, but I can still hear them sometimes when it rains." Each new page darkened the picture. There were no names, no explicit confessions of murder or disposal, but every sentence circled around an unnamed tragedy. The sheriff's department brought in experts, criminal psychologists, linguists, even a retired FBI profiler, to analyze the writing. Their conclusion was cautious but clear. Whoever wrote this had first-hand knowledge of a violent event involving two victims, one adult and one child. News spread fast. For the first time in years, the name Ellman returned to headlines. Reporters swarmed the small Illinois town. Cameras flashing, microphones thrust into the faces of locals who hadn't spoken about the case in decades. Some said they remembered Harold Dean from the farmer's market, soft-spoken, always alone. Others said they'd seen him talking to Diane once, helping her fix a flat tire outside the grocery store. Margaret, now in her late 60s, saw the report on television. Her hands trembled as she turned up the volume. The anchor's voice was calm, detached, but the words pierced her like glass. Authorities have reopened the 1985 Ellman disappearance following the discovery of journals belonging to deceased local man Harold Dean. She sat motionless for several minutes, listening to the same lines repeat, the same photographs of Diane, and Katie flashing across the screen, frozen forever in that last summer's light. Then, without thinking, she whispered, "We're close, Dee. I can feel it." The investigation reignited hope and dread in equal measure. Forensic teams searched Harold Dean's old property, digging near the shed, scanning the soil with ground-penetrating radar, dredging the small pond behind the house. They found animal bones, rusted tools, and fragments of broken glass, but no trace of Diane or Katie. Still, the journal seemed to confirm what had long been suspected but never proven, that they hadn't simply vanished into thin air. The emotional weight of it all crushed Margaret. She visited the sheriff's office, clutching a photo of Diane in her hand. She wanted to see the notebooks herself, to read every word, to know what he had written about her sister and niece. But she wasn't allowed. The contents were still part of an active investigation. "Ma'am," the officer said gently, "some of what's written there, it's not easy to read." She looked at him with hollow eyes and replied, "I haven't had an easy day in 17 years. What haunted investigators most were the final entries, dated early 1989, the year Harold stopped writing. In them, he described dreams by the river, two faces that never age, and a promise to keep the place quiet. His last words, written in shaky ink, were, "If anyone finds this, tell her I didn't mean it to go this way. I just wanted them to stay." The discovery divided the town. Some believed the journals were a confession, a written burial of guilt. Others argued they were delusions, fiction from a lonely man haunted by his own imagination. Without bodies, without physical evidence, the case remained technically unsolved. But for Margaret, it was the closest thing to truth she'd ever been offered. For years she had prayed for answers, for something to hold on to. Now she had words, terrible, sorrowful words, but still words. And in a way, that was worse than silence. Because now, she had to imagine what those pages didn't say. As autumn returned to Illinois that year, the leaves fell like ash across the old Dean property. Reporters stopped coming. The police closed their files again. And once more, the story slipped back into the quiet. But this time, something had changed. The ghosts that had slept beneath the surface of the town's memory were awake again, and they would not go back to sleep. Autumn of 2003 came softly, the kind of season that carries both beauty and unease. The trees along the Fox River blazed in reds and golds, the water slow and dark beneath them. But in Elbin, color could no longer soften the undercurrent of dread that had returned. The discovery of Harold Dean's journals had reopened every door that people had tried to close. And though the sheriff's department officially called it a development without resolution, the town could feel it. Something beneath their feet was shifting. It was around this time that a young journalist named Emily Carter arrived from Chicago. She was 27, sharp-eyed, and relentless. The kind of person who believed every mystery has a heartbeat if you listen closely enough. Emily had grown up not far from the area, and she remembered the Elman disappearances from childhood whispers. Her editor had dismissed the story as too old, too vague, but Emily couldn't shake it. She'd seen the televised coverage of the journals, seen the look on Margaret's face, and something in it, something unspoken, called to her. She drove to Elbin one overcast morning and began digging. The sheriff's office was reluctant to talk. The files were technically closed again, pending further evidence. But Emily had a way of getting people to open up. She wasn't pushy. She just asked the right questions and waited in silence. Silence, she believed, was where truth grew roots. Her first stop was the county library, where she unearthed microfilm clippings from 1985. Faded headlines, photographs of search teams, and quotes from anxious neighbors. Most of the articles stopped abruptly after the first few weeks, replaced by other local stories. But tucked in the back pages, she found a detail she hadn't heard mentioned in any documentary or police summary. A witness, a truck driver named Leon Whitby, had reported seeing a woman and a child walking along the highway near Elbin the night they disappeared. He described the woman as mid-30s, wearing a yellow dress, holding the hand of a small girl. The report was noted, but investigators at the time dismissed it, saying the sighting was too far from Diane's home to make sense. But to Emily, it wasn't nothing. That night, She checked into a small motel just outside town. She spread out photocopies of the articles across the bed, marking timelines with a red pen. The dates, the gaps, the inconsistencies, they began forming a strange, quiet pattern. The journals mentioned a storm, and local weather archives confirmed that a thunderstorm had rolled through Elbin the night Diane and Katie vanished. The truck driver's sighting was time-stamped hours before the rain began. That detail unsettled her. If Harold Dean had encountered them after the storm, as his writing implied, then where were they in those missing hours? The next morning, Emily visited Margaret. The older woman answered the door cautiously, her gray hair pinned neatly, her eyes clouded but sharp. When Emily introduced herself, Margaret hesitated. She'd spoken to reporters before, and most of them only wanted tragedy they could package neatly into sound bites. But Emily's voice was steady, kind, without pity. "I'm not here to reopen wounds," she said quietly. "I just think some of them never really closed." Margaret studied her for a moment, then opened the door wider. Inside, the house was exactly as described in old police reports, frozen in time. The wallpaper yellowed, the air faintly perfumed with lavender and dust. On the mantel were framed photographs. Diane laughing in the backyard, Katie with her first bicycle, a family picnic by the river. Everything radiated a haunting normalcy. Emily sat at the kitchen table while Margaret poured tea into 2 chipped cups. "They said the journals proved it," Margaret murmured, almost to herself. "But they didn't prove anything. Words are just ghosts until you know where they come from." "Did you ever know Harold Dean?" Emily asked. Margaret paused, only by face. "He'd come by once in a while when Diane sold baked goods at the market. Quiet man. Didn't talk much. I remember Diane said he looked lonely." Emily nodded, jotting down notes, though her mind was racing. The journals had painted Harold as obsessed, remorseful, but never explicitly violent. And now, this small detail, that he had known Diane, linked him more intimately to the story than the case files had ever confirmed. After their meeting, Margaret led her to the porch. "Sometimes," she said softly, "I think the worst thing isn't not knowing what happened. It's knowing that someone does know, and they've taken that with them." That sentence followed Emily back to her motel. She couldn't sleep. She reread her notes, flipped through her recordings, and then did something impulsive. She drove out to the old Dean property in the middle of the night. The house was still there, fenced off with a rusted chain. Moonlight washed over the porch, illuminating a crooked screen door that creaked softly in the wind. She parked at the edge of the gravel drive and stepped out. The air smelled of damp earth and autumn decay. Her flashlight cut through the dark as she circled the house. Inside, the windows were boarded, but the outline of furniture still showed through. A table, a chair, something that might have been a mirror, near the back of the property. She found the shed that had been searched years earlier. Its door hung open, hinges nearly gone. She stepped inside carefully. Dust motes swirled in her beam of light. Tools lined the walls, rusted saws, a dented shovel, empty jars. Then, in one corner, she noticed something odd. Beneath the warped floorboards, the ground looked recently disturbed, not by much, but enough to catch her eye. She crouched, brushed the dirt with her hand. Nothing solid, just a faint scent of rot and oil. It might have been nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing. She took a few photos and left. The drive back to town was silent, except for the hum of tires on wet asphalt. Yet even as she pulled into the motel, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been followed. The next morning, Emily called the sheriff's office to report what she'd found. The deputy on duty told her the property had already been searched thoroughly in 2002. "There's nothing out there, ma'am," he said, his voice tired. But when she hung up, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. On the seat beside her, where she'd tossed her camera, there was a faint smudge of mud, fresh, dark, and shaped like a single fingertip. She stared at it for a long time, her breath shallow. Then she whispered, almost like a prayer, "What did I just wake up?" That night, she opened her laptop and began typing the first lines of what would become her article. 17 years ago, a mother and daughter disappeared in Elbin, Illinois. Everyone thought the case was buried, but some stories refused to stay dead. What Emily didn't know then was that by chasing the truth, she was stepping directly into the story itself, one that hadn't yet finished writing her in. The wind picked up outside, scattering the last of the leaves against her motel window. Somewhere, far from the city lights, the Fox River moved in its slow, secret rhythm, carrying the memory of everything it had ever hidden. Rain came early that winter. It fell in long, steady curtains across the Illinois plains, coating the highways in silver, washing the leaves from the trees until the world looked stripped bare. Emily Carter stayed in Elbin longer than she intended. What was supposed to be a week-long investigation had stretched into months. Each new detail seemed to pull her deeper, as if the town itself was a puzzle that kept rearranging its pieces when she wasn't looking. By December, she had spoken to nearly everyone who still remembered the Elmans. Farmers, old teachers, former search volunteers. Most were cautious, unwilling to revisit the grief. Some refused to speak at all. But one name kept reappearing in quiet, hesitant tones. Daniel Price, Harold Dean's former co-worker at a local lumber mill. He had moved away years ago, but Emily tracked him down through an address buried in public employment records. Daniel was 70 now, living in a small town 2 hours north. He agreed to meet her at a diner, the kind with vinyl booths and the smell of coffee steeped into the walls. He arrived wearing a cap that said Midwest Forestry Association, his eyes guarded but kind. When Emily mentioned Harold Dean, Daniel's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "That man," he said softly. He was strange, not dangerous. Exactly. Just wrong somehow. Like he was carrying a weight that didn't belong to him. He told her that Harold had been quiet, hard-working, and solitary, but occasionally slipped into odd moods. Days when he'd vanished from work without explanation. Once, Dana recalled, Harold had come in drenched from rain, trembling, saying he'd seen him again near the river. Everyone assumed he was talking about hallucinations or dreams. But now, Daniel said, I don't know what to think. Emily asked if Harold had ever mentioned a woman or child. Daniel hesitated before answering. There was one time, he said, he asked me if I believed people could forgive you even if they never got the chance to. That line stayed with her long after she left the diner. Forgiveness. The word didn't fit easily into the story she was writing. It suggested guilt, not confusion. And guilt meant knowledge. Back at her motel, Emily pulled the scanned pages of Harold's journals onto her laptop screen again. She'd been granted partial access through a source at the sheriff's department. She'd read them so many times she could almost hear the man's voice, shaky, unsure, desperate. But there were two entries she had overlooked, both dated the same day, August 14th, 1985, the day before Diane and Katie vanished. The first read, I fixed a window for her today. She smiled again. She said, maybe she'd bring the little one by next week. The house feels alive when they're here. The second, scrawled at the bottom of the same page, sometimes I wish I could stop time before things change. That date haunted her. It wasn't just proximity, it was intention. He'd seen Diane the day before. That meant she'd been near his property, willingly. Emily began cross-referencing the addresses. Diane's home was 5 miles from Harold's farmhouse, with a thin stretch of woods connecting them along the river. She printed an old survey map and traced both points with red ink. Between them, she noticed something else, a disused trail-marked riverside access road, abandoned since the early 80s. It ran directly behind both properties. That night, she drove out there. The air was cold enough to sting. Her headlights cut a pale tunnel through the fog, revealing skeletal trees and gravel half-buried under moss. She parked where the old road began to crumble and stepped out, flashlight in hand. The woods were silent, except for the rain dripping through branches. The ground sucked at her boots as she walked. The deeper she went, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustling, only her breath and the rhythmic sound of rain on dead leaves. Then she saw it, a fragment of wood half-rotted, protruding from the mud. She knelt and brushed it off. It wasn't a branch. It was the corner of a small crate, the kind used for tools or storage. Inside, she found nothing but shards of glass and what looked like a rusted bracelet clasp. It could have been coincidence, junk buried by time, but the weight in her chest said otherwise. She took photos, marked the GPS coordinates, and backed away. That night, she barely slept. Her dreams flickered between the sound of Diane's name whisper on the wind and the image of the river swallowing something whole. The next morning, she brought her findings to Detective Hayes, the same investigator who had handled the journals. He was older now, his posture stooped, but his eyes were sharp with exhaustion. When Emily told him about the road, he sighed. "We searched that area years ago," he said. "Nothing there." "But not the ground," she pressed. "Not like this. That trail runs right between them, like a vein. He used it." Hayes leaned back. "You're chasing ghosts, Miss Carter. And ghosts don't talk." "Maybe not," she said, "but they leave footprints." He studied her for a long moment before nodding. "You've got one day. I'll send a unit." By dusk, a small team was combing the woods where she'd been. The officers were methodical, slow, careful. Emily stood at the edge, watching floodlights cut through the trees like artificial dawn. Hours passed. Then one of the men shouted. They'd found something. Buried beneath the wet earth, under layers of soil and roots, were fragments of what looked like fabric. Small, tattered, and pale. It was too early to tell what it was, or if it was even related. But as they lifted it from the ground, the air around them changed. Everyone went quiet. A forensic specialist examined it under light. The texture was consistent with cotton clothing from the 1980s, child-sized. There were traces of faded blue dye, maybe from a dress. No bones, no blood, just a fragile memory of a life once worn. Emily turned away, her throat tightening. The detective rested a hand on her shoulder. "This might not be what you think," he said softly. But she knew. She didn't need confirmation, not yet. The soil had spoken louder than the journals. Later that night, back in her motel room, she stared at the photo of the fragment glowing on her laptop screen. She thought of Katie's laughter, the way people described it in interviews, bright and unguarded, and of how silence had replaced it for almost 2 decades. Outside, thunder rolled across the fields. Emily whispered to herself, "You're still here, aren't you?" The rain answered in soft applause against the glass, as if the world itself was confirming what she feared most, that stories like this don't end. They just keep waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to turn the next page. And though she didn't yet know it, that night marked the point where the investigation stopped being about Diane and Katie alone. From then on, it became about the ghosts that lived inside everyone who couldn't let go, the witnesses, the neighbors, the detectives, and Emily herself, each carrying a piece of the truth half buried, just waiting to be unearthed. The discovery spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, the unearthed fragment of blue fabric had transformed Elbin from a town of ghosts into a town under siege. Reporters flooded the streets. Police taped cordon off the woods, and satellite vans idled along the rural roads where nothing ever happened anymore. For a place that had learned to live in silence, the sudden noise felt like an exorcism, one that no one had asked for. Detective Hayes stood in the mud, arms crossed, watching as evidence technicians sealed another bag. He'd seen dozens of cases reopen like this, with hope, noise, and fury, only to collapse back into nothing. But this time was different. The fragment matched the era. The soil layer aligned with the mid-1980s. And the location was exactly between Diane's home and Harold Dean's property. Coincidence had officially run out of places to hide. Emily stood beside him, her notepad soaked, hair sticking to her face in the drizzle. She was exhausted, half sick from the cold, but she couldn't leave. Something in her refused to step back. Every flash of a camera, every rustle of a plastic evidence bag. It all felt like the edge of an answer. That night, she checked into a different motel, farther from the reporters. She called her editor, breathless, explaining what they'd found. "If this is what we think it is," he said, "we'll run it as a front-page exclusive." But Emily hesitated. The story wasn't a headline to her anymore. It was a heartbeat, one that had started syncing with her own. She sat by the window, replaying everything in her head. The journals, the trail, the bracelet clasp Margaret's trembling hands. The rain outside turned heavier, loud enough to drown her thoughts. She reached for her phone and hesitated before dialing Margaret's number. When the older woman answered, Her voice was barely a whisper. "Mrs. Ellman, it's Emily. They found something today, near the river trail." A long pause. The sound of shallow breathing. Was it hers? "We don't know yet," Emily said, "but it might be. It's a start." Margaret didn't reply right away. Then, softly, "I prayed for a sign. I didn't think it would hurt this much to get one." Emily didn't sleep that night. She kept the light on, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady hum of the motel's heater. She felt as though she was sitting between two versions of the same story, one that belonged to the living and one that the dead were still trying to tell. The next morning, she drove back to the woods. The air was colder now, sharp with the metallic scent of earth and rain. Hayes was already there, standing with two forensic experts. They were carefully documenting the site before expanding the search area. "Preliminary report came in," Hayes said, glancing up from his clipboard. "That fabric, child's cotton dress, circa 1980s. We're running DNA tests now, but after all this time," his voice trailed off. Emily knew what he meant. 17 years buried. The odds were slim. But she also knew that hope doesn't need odds. It only needs persistence. As the digging continued, the woods grew quieter. Reporters were kept at a distance, their questions muffled by the hum of generators. Then, just before noon, one of the forensic officers called out. They'd found something else. A small tin locket, tarnished and bent, hidden in the soil less than 2 feet from fabric. Inside, beneath a cracked piece of glass, was a photograph of a little girl and her mother, faded, water-stained, but unmistakable. Diane and Katie. Emily's throat closed. Hayes took the locket, his face pale under the gray sky. "Get this photographed," he ordered quietly. "Now." The discovery confirmed what Margaret had feared and long suspected. Diane and Katie hadn't vanished. They'd been buried right here, in the quiet space between two homes, hidden by the river and time. When Margaret was told, she didn't cry at first. She just closed her eyes and whispered something no one caught. Later, she said it was thank you, not to the detectives, not to Emily, but to Diane. "For letting us find her," she explained softly. "For not staying lost forever." The news broke across national outlets that evening. The words "Elbin Mystery Solved" blazed across television screens. Forensic teams continued digging for days, but no remains surfaced. Only fragments, personal items, traces of life that had once filled laughter and breath. Still, the discovery was enough to change everything. The journals were reclassified as evidence in a homicide case. Harold Dean's name returned to the headlines, painted now as a ghostly villain, the silent farmer, they called him. But Emily couldn't accept the simplicity of that. There was something in those writings that didn't fit the portrait of a cold killer. Regret, yes. Obsession, maybe, but something about it still felt unfinished. She revisited the journals, rereading every entry, every scratch of ink. That's when she noticed something new, a page near the end that she hadn't paid close attention to before. It was written in a shaking hand, the ink smeared as if by tears or rain. She said the river would keep their secret. I said the river keeps nothing. The pronouns stopped her cold. She said, not they said. Who was she? Emily combed through every report again, looking for other possible names connected to Harold Dean. One stood out, Helen Monroe, a neighbor who had once lived half a mile from his farmhouse. She'd moved away in 1987, sold her land quickly, and left no forwarding address. Emily tracked her down through an old property deed and a digitized census record. Helen was living now in Missouri, 72 years old. Emily called her, introducing herself and explaining the reason for her inquiry. There was a long silence on the line. Then Helen said quietly, "You shouldn't stir this up again." "Ma'am," Emily replied, "I think you knew Harold Dean." Another pause. "I did," she said, "and I know what he buried. But it wasn't just him." The line went dead. Emily sat there, frozen. The phone still pressed her ear. Her heart raced. That one sentence had detonated everything she thought she knew. It wasn't just him. For the first time, she realized the story might not be about a single man's guilt, but a chain of silence, choices layered over decades, People who had seen something, heard something, done nothing. The quiet of Elbin wasn't ignorance. It was complicity. That night, she wrote in her notes, if Harold Dean buried them, someone helped him. If he didn't, someone let him take the blame. The snow began falling outside, thick and soundless. It blanketed the town in white, muffling every noise, covering every scar. But beneath that perfect stillness, the truth was moving, restless, inevitable, clawing its way back to the surface. And for Emily, the realization came with a strange, sinking dread, because the deeper she went, the more it felt like the story wasn't about the past anymore. It was about right now. Someone else was still alive. Someone who had kept a secret for 17 years. And someone who, she suspected, was watching her finally get too close. Snow still blanketed the Illinois countryside when Emily woke that morning with the unmistakable sense that something had shifted. The case had become heavier overnight, not in evidence, but in weight. Every unanswered question now carried the density of something deliberate, something hidden beneath layers of time and fear. She moved through her motel room quietly, the muted light leaking through the blinds, painting pale stripes across the wall. Her notebook sat open on the table, filled with half-finished thoughts and theories written in a hand that had grown more frantic each day. One phrase, circled 3 times, stared back at her. It wasn't just him. She drove to the police department through a thin curtain of snow, the radio murmuring static and weather reports. Inside, Detective Hayes sat behind his desk, a cup of coffee cooling beside a stack of evidence files. His eyes lifted when she entered, but his face revealed nothing. Emily handed him her latest notes, including the call transcript with Helen Monroe. She said it wasn't just Harold. Emily explained, voice low, I think there was someone else, someone in town. Hayes leaned back, sighing through his nose. Helen Monroe's name came up before. She testified that she hardly knew Dean, said he kept to himself. She lied. Emily said simply, I could hear it in her voice. Hayes studied her for a long moment. You're starting to sound like the people you write about. I'm starting to understand them, she replied. That day, the department approved a follow-up on Helen Monroe. They reached out to local authorities in Missouri to question her, but before the visit could be scheduled, the report came back. Helen had been found dead in her home 2 days after Emily's call. The cause, a fall down the basement stairs. Accidental, the report said. But Emily didn't believe in coincidences anymore. She sat in her car outside the station, the world silent except for the hiss of the heater and the ticking of the clock. A strange feeling settled in her stomach. Not fear exactly, but recognition. The kind that tells you the story you've been chasing might start chasing you back. That night, she drove to Margaret Ellman's house again. The old woman met her at the door, thinner now, the lines in her face deeper than before. She listened quietly as Emily recounted the new developments, the discovery in the woods, the locket, the strange call, the neighbor's sudden death. I always thought Harold did it, Margaret said after a long pause. But sometimes I wonder if he didn't act alone. He had friends in town, people who owed him, people who kept his secrets. Did he have any close relationships? Emily asked. Just one I can remember, Margaret said. The Monroes. Helen and her husband, Richard. They owned the feed store back then. Harold worked for them after his wife died. They said he was odd but loyal. Emily's pen froze over the page. Richard Monroe? He passed years ago, Margaret said. But Helen, she left right after the disappearances. I always thought that was strange. A heavy silence settled over the room. The clock ticked in the corner. Emily looked up and caught Margaret watching her carefully. Be careful, dear, the old woman whispered. Sometimes the truth doesn't want to be found. Emily left before dark. As she drove through the snowy fields, she noticed a car in her rearview mirror, headlights too steady, following too long. She turned down a side road. The car followed. Her pulse spiked. She slowed near a gas station, pretended to pull in, and the car sped past. For a moment, she sat frozen, staring at the empty road ahead. She'd been warned. Back at her motel, she locked the door, pushed a chair under the handle, and opened her laptop. She began piecing together everything she knew. creating a timeline of connections between the Deans, the Monroes, and Diane's family. She found one odd overlap. Both families had attended the same small church, led by a pastor who retired mysteriously the same year Diane disappeared. The pastor's name was Reverend Hollis. She searched for him. A small obituary appeared, died in 1994. But below it, a related article caught her eye. Local church closes after financial scandal. The date matched the summer Diane vanished. The article mentioned 3 board members accused of embezzling church funds: Richard Monroe, Harold Dean, and one other name she didn't recognize, Thomas Ellman. Emily froze. Ellman, Diane's husband. Her fingers trembled as she reread the line. Thomas Ellman, the grieving husband who had spent years insisting Harold was guilty, had been entangled financially with both men. If true, the web wasn't about one jealous neighbor or a violent recluse. It was about something far larger: money, secrets, betrayal. She cross-referenced bank records and property deeds from that era. It was all there. Transactions hidden under false names, land exchanged quietly between the men. The farmhouse where the journals were found had once been jointly owned by the Monroes and Ellman, before being transferred solely to Harold Dean in 1984. Emily felt cold all over. She sat back, staring at the wall, realizing what that meant. The land where the journals were discovered, the same ground where Diane and Katie had vanished, had originally belonged to the man who claimed to love them most. She whispered the words aloud, as if hearing them might make them less real. Thomas knew. The next day, she brought the findings to Hayes. He read the documents slowly, jaw tightening. If what you're saying is right, then Harold might have been the scapegoat, and Thomas Ellman, the grieving husband, might have helped bury them. But why? Emily asked, her voice breaking. Why bury your own family? Hayes looked up at her, the weight of 30 years of cases in his eyes. Because sometimes love curdles into something worse than hate. They reopened the Ellman file officially. A warrant was issued to search the property where Thomas had lived, now abandoned, standing gray and hollow on the outskirts of town. Emily was allowed to observe from a distance. The team moved through the house slowly, their flashlights slicing through the dark. Dust hung thick in the air, undisturbed for decades. In the basement, behind a wall of rusted shelves, they found a hollow space, a crawl area sealed with rotted boards. Inside lay a metal box, wrapped in a torn floral blanket. When they opened it, the smell of damp paper filled the air. Inside were letters, dozens of them, each addressed to M. The handwriting was unmistakably Diane's. They were written during the months before her disappearance, never mailed. One of them began, "He's changed, Mother. He gets angry when I mention leaving. He says if I go, he'll take Katie where I can't follow." Hayes read the letter twice before folding it carefully back into the envelope. "We've been looking at the wrong man all along," he said quietly. Emily stepped outside into the cold air, her breath fogging in front of her. The town stretched silent under the snow as though it, too, had been holding its breath for 17 years. The truth had finally started to emerge, jagged, merciless, and unstoppable. But even as Emily felt the weight of revelation settle over her, she knew this wasn't the end. Because somewhere in those letters, between Diane's fear and the lies that followed, another presence lingered. Someone else who knew, someone who had been helping all along to keep the silence sealed. And now, with every word she wrote, Emily could feel that silence beginning to stir, restless, angry, alive. The journal was a strange thing to hold, small, leather-bound, worn soft at the edges like it had been passed through too many hands. Emily sat by the motel window, the dim glow of a streetlight falling over the pages. The ink had faded in places, but the handwriting was careful, deliberate, and intimate. It began in late 1984, months before Diane and Katie disappeared. The first entries were almost ordinary. Notes about the weather, observations about a woman who lives 2 streets down, mentions of the girl with the yellow backpack. The writer, identified only by the initials T, spoke about them the way someone might describe distant friends, except there was something unsettling in the way he wrote about watching. She waters her flowers at dusk. One entry read, The child always leave the porch light on when she's scared. By the third page, the tone shifted. The writer wasn't simply observing anymore. He was recording visits. The entries mentioned standing by their porch, seeing the curtains move, leaving notes that weren't answered. There was longing there, but also anger, resentment that the mother didn't recognize him. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages. The language was poetic, even tender, but beneath it ran something cold and obsessive. As she continued reading, the timeline drew closer to July 1985, the month Diane and Katie vanished. "Tonight she spoke to me," one entry said. "Not in words, but I felt it. She knows who I am now. She knows why I'm here." The next few pages were stained, the ink blurred by what looked like water damage. Then came a final clear line dated July 18th. "When the light goes out, we will all be together again." Emily looked up from the page, her reflection in the window glass pale and hollow. Outside, the motel sign buzzed faintly, a low electric hum that filled the silence. She felt the chill of recognition. This wasn't just a stranger's delusion. The dates, the handwriting, the initials, they matched a man named Thomas Everett, a local handyman who'd vanished from Elbin around the same week as Diane and Katie. He'd been briefly questioned back then, but nothing tied him directly to the case. She flipped to the back of the journal and found a folded map, yellowed and brittle. A circle had been drawn around a spot by the Fox River, a place marked the Quiet Turn. The handwriting beneath it read, "That's where the truth sleeps." Emily called Detective Hayes at once. When they met near the riverbank the next morning, the mist hung thick over the water, swallowing sound. The two of them followed the coordinates, their boots crunching over frozen soil. After about 20 minutes, they reached a shallow depression near the trees, half hidden by fallen branches. The ground there looked disturbed, as if something had been buried long ago. Hayes called for a team, and when the crew arrived with equipment, the dig was careful, methodical. It took hours. Then from the dark earth, something metallic glinted, a small key. No bones, no remains. Just a key, and next to it, a rusted bracelet with the initials K. E. Emily's throat tightened. "Katie Elman," she whispered. Hayes nodded, his face unreadable. "This doesn't close it," he said quietly. "But it tells us she didn't just disappear." As the team packed up, Emily looked toward the water. The river moved slowly, reflecting a pale winter sun. She thought of Diane and Katie, how their lives had become stories told by others, reshaped and retold until the edges blurred. But now, through the voice of the man who'd watched them, through the words he left behind, something raw and haunting had surfaced. Not just the cruelty of obsession, but the way love, when twisted by loneliness, could turn into something that devoured everything around it. Back in her car, she sat with the journal open on her lap. The final page caught the wind from the open door, fluttering as if alive. She read it again, that last, fragile line, and whispered it under her breath. "When the light goes out." The words felt heavier now, as if the night itself remembered them, and as she looked once more toward the river, Emily knew the story had reached its truth, but not its end. Snow drifted through the air like ash as Emily left Elbin behind. The case was closed now, the file sealed, the headlines written, but it didn't feel like closure. The drive back to Chicago felt endless, the road stretching through white silence. Every mile seemed to whisper the same thought. Some truths never rest. Back in her apartment, the city lights looked harsh after the stillness of that town. She unpacked slowly, setting the journals, the photographs, and the scarf-wrapped diary on her desk. They didn't look like evidence anymore. They looked like ghosts. Her editor called, praising the story's reach. "You gave those women their voices back," he said. But Emily didn't answer. She was staring at the small metal key still lying beside her laptop. T, etched faintly on its handle. She hadn't told anyone about it. Not Hayes. Not Margaret. Not the department. Some part of her didn't want to. The key felt personal, unfinished. That evening, an envelope arrived in her mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single photograph of the riverbank, the one where she'd found the key. In the distance, half hidden in the trees, stood a shadowy figure. On the back were 3 words written in a looping, unfamiliar hand. "You missed something." Emily stared at it until the edges of the photo blurred. Then she looked at the key again, cold in her palm. The storm outside deepened, wind pressing against the glass. Somewhere, faintly, she thought she heard the river, not in memory, but alive, whispering through the dark. And she understood then the story wasn't over. It had simply gone quiet, waiting for her to listen again.